This is a Step Beyond the Fire podcast. My name is Cully. I'm a land manager and a wildlife biologist here in my home state of Florida. I invite you to join me on a journey as I seek to document the little-known stories told by those who use fire for the benefit of the land, also known as prescribed fire. So come on, let's head into the field and meet the people where the flame ends and new life begins. Support for A Step Beyond the Fire podcast is due in part to the following sponsor.
Hello, this is Scott Crosby, owner of Crosby Forestry and GIS Services, LLC. My mission is to help private landowners with their forest management needs. I specialize in timber sales, reforestation, forest management plans, and exotic plant mapping. Check out my website at crosbyforestry.com to find out how my 33 years of forestry experience in Florida can help serve you and your land management needs. I will look forward to speaking with you about how to turn your land into forest and forest into cash with a stewardship ethic.
Welcome back, listeners, to another episode of A Step Beyond the Fire podcast. I'm here today with Rick Anderson. Now, Rick Anderson is a 10th generation Floridian who has a wide variety of fire experiences that encompasses projects in Costa Rica, Belize, Mexico, and the United States. His experience in fire spans an unusually broad range, having learned to burn from his ancestors on their family ranch, which eventually led him into a career in fire. His current focus is refining and developing fuel models for fire risk assessment and fire effects monitoring for tropical ecosystems. Welcome to the show, Rick. I'm really glad you're here.
Oh, Cully, thanks for the invitation and much respect for what you're doing with this podcast. Really appreciate it.
You're tuning in from the bustling metropolis of Venus, Florida today. Is that right?
Yeah. Venus is a fairly remote community about 15 miles west of Lake Okeechobee and about 50 years from Orlando. So, and I think you know what I mean. It's one of the little pockets of Florida where our culture still remains fairly strong. I would probably say Arcadia or LaBelle is kind of our capital cities, with pretty little Lake Placid to the north of me, where the culture starts to shift to more of the Central Florida world.
Sure. Yeah, it's a beautiful area down there. I've spent a little bit of time in your neck of the woods, and
right.
I'm certainly very grateful that you've joined us today. And we're doing this one remote, and that's how we've been able to make this one happen. So I'm excited. So speaking of culture, what you mentioned, I don't meet many people that have grown up in a family culture that involved prescribed fire. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Well, and I'd like to put it in even a broader context. I was, of course, born in the late 50s and raised in rural Florida in the 60s and early 70s. And Florida, as you probably realize, was a very different place at that point. There was a kind of a J curve of population when Disney showed up in the 70s, and just the story of Florida. So at that time, it wasn't particularly unusual for just about anybody that lived in rural areas would have been involved in burning one way or another, or using fire for the variety of reasons, whether it was cleaning out land, as we would say, for good hunting areas, the usual reasons, stimulating forage for wildlife and grazing and that kind of thing. So it was like my grandfather once said when I asked him, I said, "What is all this burning around us, and why are we doing all of this burning?" And he says, "Well, it's kind of our job. It's the way we keep things clean." And he says, for example, why does your granny sweep the yard and sweep the house? It's to keep things freshened up and looking good. So it wasn't that unusual. It was fairly normalized. But you can imagine as the population exploded, fence laws didn't come into this part of Florida till the late 50s, and you can imagine that they were slow to be adopted. And also there was attitudes toward fire at that time that was very, very different. If you know a little bit about Florida's forestry and fire history, this part of Florida was not, even though there was timber coming out of the big cypress and certainly the pinelands down here were being used for a variety of reasons, whether it was logs or turpentine. It wasn't a big timber culture like it was, for example, in the Red Hills of North Florida and that kind of place. So the real objective was to keep the land burned off to produce for productivity reasons. And I remember asking my grandfather, it's like, well, where did our people learn to burn? And he says, well, I think we probably brought it with us from the old country. And of course, most of the folks in this part of the world are old Celtic people that would have been burning the heaths and heathers and moors of Scotland and Ireland and that border country up there. So when we got to the southeast here, fire was, like they tell me in Brazil, the poor man's plow. And so it was certainly a captured technology, if you will, that, and you can imagine a lot of my ancestors and a lot of the multi-generational Floridians, many of them were brought over as indentured servants. They weren't part of the plantation culture. They didn't have land. And one way that you could establish a piece of land is taking care of it. One of the ways you took care of it was through burning. But I certainly, growing up in Florida with smoke columns all around or fire flanking the road, that was common. So you got to see a lot of fire and observe it the way you would weather or wildlife or a lot of just the natural things that everybody depended on. Fire was just another kind of pulse on the landscape in a living landscape. It certainly wasn't as big of an issue. And of course, I might have mentioned that the open burning laws did not get enforced or they weren't really a big deal until much later than essentially my childhood and beyond as well.
So you spent quite a bit of your childhood on the fire line, I guess, huh?
Well, again, it wasn't so much that I spent a lot of time on the fire line. It's just fire was just a common thing to use, and frankly, until probably the foresters got a hold of silvicultural burning, even the idea of like plowed fire lines, which really didn't show up until after World War II, with the mechanization and the kind of the box and burn techniques the foresters like to use. In this part of the world, we really use the wetlands, the ecotones, the transitions, and if I learned anything as a child and growing up, is really how to understand the fuels. What will burn and what wouldn't burn, and kind of a proper time, because one way to say it in a pejorative sense is that if you're just a couple of 2, 4, 6 people doing a burn, you're going to do it the most sensible way possible. And none of us like to fight fire. So we would burn, it was more again, like sweeping the house or sweeping the yard. It was contained by the kind of the structural, and native forest around us. For example, you'd burn at a time when you could burn the uplands and it would run down into the wetlands. And then conversely, when the wetlands dried out, you had the uplands, like the longleaf country or the Florida scrub or a good prairie. And then you'd flip over and burn the wetlands and get them burned off, because the cows or the wildlife or the whole suite of species that we depended on were going to use the landscape in Florida. Even though we don't have mountains, as you well know, we have these interlocking landscapes down here that give us our biological diversity and our species diversity. And in the old days, biological diversity translated into food and livelihoods. So in other words, again, it wasn't, and there often wasn't necessarily a plan for burning. It was like, today's a good day to burn. We would look at how expanded the pine cones were. For example, pine cones are really good fuel moisture meter, if you know what you mean. I know if you know what I mean. I know you've seen this as well. When a pine cone's laying on the ground, it can wick up the soil moisture. And if the atmosphere and the soil moisture is wet or relatively damp, that pine cone will collapse a little bit. If it's extremely dry, that pine cone will be crunchy. So very early on, even as children, we would learn that if you can grab a pine cone and you can crunch it and it's going to fall apart on you, that's not a good day to put a fire on the ground. So
wow. That's a great way of looking at it.
Yeah, and of course and we're looking at inheriting some of this knowledge multi-generational. But also at that time, people knew how to make tables and chairs in their houses. They knew how to repair pots and pans. And I'm bringing up this little sidebar because it was just part of the way of life, how you would interact with the land, and there was no cavalry coming to kind of save you or subsidize you at that point in our history as well. So there was a lot of incentive, and also, like a lot of my culture would tell you, is that we paid a pretty high price for this land in a lot of ways, and it wasn't a price in money; it was a price in kind of historical legacy, and there was a lot of insecurity for many years if you were on a piece of land because you didn't necessarily know if you owned it or not, and the government could easily take it away. For example, a good chunk of Big Cypress and some of the protected areas that we have, especially federal protected areas, were acquired by eminent domain. So there was lot of investment by individuals to take care of your land. And one of the things, probably the best compliment I can get on my little home site here in Venus, because right across the road is, it's surrounded by ranch country and large land owners like Ben Hill Griffin and Hendry's and many others. And sometimes when the cowboys are coming down the road and they've seen the area that I burned on my side, I might get the ultimate compliment from them, and it's looks good. And and what I think they mean is that we've done good by the ground cover, because it really for us, and I don't mean to be disparaging for foresters, because they certainly have brought us so much, but we're not really tree people. It's the ground cover where the magic happens. And I think maybe some larger environmental organization might say pyrodiversity begets or makes biodiversity. And without those fancy words, if you were going to hunt turkey, quail, or if you just needed to move through, a pretty good sized palmetto patch, and you had that technology in your pocket to make things a little better, a little easier, and more productive, then you used it.
Another fun fact you had mentioned was that you're at the extreme southern end of the range of the longleaf pine. Isn't that right?
Yes. Yeah, I am. And I actually noticed, I've lived on this particular site for just over 20 years. And it was there was nobody living on this particular tract of land when I moved in. And it had that mix of longleaf and slash pine. And I never really understood in my early days is like slash pine and longleaf are so similar. Why did they, why did they bother to become two species? But if you live with these trees, you see that they pollinate at different times. They occupy slightly different habitat. And I'm talking about down here, just a matter of a few inches in elevation can change everything. So this is where longleaf kind of starts diminishing. Flat branch, which is a WMA to the south of me, I suspect that they probably have a patch over there. And I understand that down at Hickey's Creek, a little farther south in Lee County, there's a longleaf or two down there. But this is kind of Pine Island country, and it's Pine Islands interspersed with large prairies. And there's prairie ecosystems and wetlands before we fall off into the Fishing Creek drainage and the upper Everglades. We're kind of Everglades-like and kind of Central Florida-like here. So yeah, I'm looking at longleaf right outside the window right now. And I tell you one thing that I've seen over the years, we're getting wetter and wetter down here. Something may be going on with the climate. I don't know. But the longleaf, I've got a couple of old longleaf that I'm looking at right now out the window, and they're old flat top ladies, and they're starting to drop off. It looks like they're getting in some form of senescence, and it looks like they're probably going to be dead within several months here. And
Wow.
as much as I think I know about longleaf, and that's the thing about living on a patch like this, you see some mysteries, and sadly, I will have to confess too. I think I know a lot about fire as well, but I've killed some old longleaf here by using fire, and it took me a long time to understand why those particular areas dropped off, and it really connects to some research like folks like around Tall Timbers and Morgan Barner from Florida.
I've read some of his papers. Yeah, I like his work.
Right, and it wasn't about duff so much. We have this idea that and it's now been proven by some of this work. Once you get a good long unburned longleaf pine, you get that duff accumulation, and then you burn it, then you heat girdle the tree, and it drops off. But that certainly wasn't the case here. What I think I did is I burn when the ground was wet, which is one of our kind of prescriptive criteria, is burn when the ground is wet and the wind is quiet. And that keeps me in the objectives that I want to have. But I think the temperatures were around above 90 degrees the day I burned. So with an old longleaf that had been through hurricanes, had been through some inundation, was probably not in the best site. There was probably a time when it was a very dry site. And now with the hydrology changes, I probably stressed it and tipped it over the edge, and that whole stand. But of course, when the cowboys come by, they say, looks good, because they're not tree people.
Sure. Well, snags are nature's condominiums, right?
They sure are, and during my days as a division supervisor on one of these Type 1 teams, one of my big things that I had some control over was along the fire line is which trees got dropped. So it gave me great joy to pull the hot shots and the saw crews off of those snags that didn't need to be dropped, or sport falling as we called it back in those days. And because I'm a big believer, and probably the data shows this too, is snags are a really good place. There's probably more biodiversity in an old snag than there is in just a green pine tree. And I know that because I've got a whole suite of woodpecker species here. And I just watched a yellow rat snake a couple of weeks ago crawl up one of these old pines to get inside somebody's nest cavity up in there. So it seems like everybody's benefiting from having a few dead trees.
Definitely. Well, it's really neat to hear about your legacy there and your family's impact in the area and some of the neat experiences that you grew up with. And you also, before we scheduled this interview, you had mentioned some of this interesting work that you've been involved with over the years. And I thought it was a good time to talk about one of the most fascinating aspects of fire, really, for me. And that's how it was such a critical part of life for indigenous people long before we were ever here, too.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about your experiences with fire culture involving indigenous people?
Yeah, it's a complicated subject, as you can imagine, because it's
sure.
First off, I'd like to say is that we are all indigenous to this planet, and most of us, I would imagine, if we went back several generations, that our ancestors were probably, say, if you did go back 10 or 15 or 20 generations, your ancestors were probably indigenous fire users somewhere, whether it would be in Sweden or Scotland,
sure,
or the Amazon basin. So I'll just put that out there. And of course, the signature of humans all over Florida. One of the things that's shocking, if you've ever looked at an archaeological map of Florida, as well as some of the Spanish records, as well as British and French as well, and you look at the anthropologists and some of their recent work here in Florida, and Florida was the Florida that we love, the Florida that we manage for good conservation outcomes, had a lot of people in it. You can imagine there was a reason why. It was a very productive place. For example, I mentioned to you I was down at the Everglades, both as fire ecologist there, and then later as a fire management officer. And we worked very closely, even though we had a tough relationship at sometimes with both the Miccosukees and Seminoles. And one of the things that I learned about being in that part of the world, and it really opened my eyes to the greater Florida Peninsula. For example, the modern Everglades as we know it has only been up out of water for probably 5, 6, 7,000 years. I think that's probably still a current way to say it. And indigenous people have lived in South Florida well before 6,000 years ago. For example, some of the sites, whether it's Wendover or over over on the west coast of Florida, some of these indigenous sites are pushing back to around 13,000 years, and they keep pushing that date back. And I bring that up both to tie it to Florida, and you look at the amount of mounds, archaeological sites, significant, especially along the Kissimmee River and along the coastlines. There's significant populations that would have had to not only use fire, but they would have had to sustain their landscapes, because if it's one thing for us to make a little mistake on our objectives on a prescribed burn for conservation reasons, but if you're eating off the landscape and for many other reasons, whether it's spiritual or other belief systems, it's going to be really important to get it right. And one of the things we have to remember about indigenous people, and this holds true with almost all the indigenous people I work anywhere, they have about 13,000 years worth of data. So they got a little head start on us in a lot of,
I guess they do, huh?
a lot of the science. And I don't think they care if their standard error bars overlap on our histogram for a peer-reviewed paper that was done from a 3-year study. So I think you get where I'm going with that.
Right.
And again, there's a lot at stake to using fire right for Homo sapiens in general, no matter what culture you're from. Unfortunately, and for example, just to get back to the Seminoles and Miccosukee, one of the things I would gently have discussions with some of the folks I was able to speak with there about fire use. And one of the things that they would tell me, they said, you have to remember there was a point in history that if we lit a fire, that somebody would find us. So we really stopped a lot of our burning practices. And I never want to speak for the Miccosukee or Seminoles, because they can certainly speak for themselves. But the information I got from them was there was a time where they just had to be quiet with fire. And what that did, and I think that happened with our culture as well, the collective, our culture in North America came in a different way. But once fire becomes vilified or a problem, it's easy to step away from it. And then once you do that, then you start losing the cultural knowledge. And there becomes a broken relationship with fire. And then we get society, economies change, what life pathways change, and then we're in a completely different circumstance. But in other words, we lost the library somewhere along the way. And I see that particularly in the western part of the United States, where there's many cultures that have little vestiges of their fire history, their fire meaning, and their fire stories and their fire songs. And they're doing a fairly good job in some places of reclaiming those. But dropping down into Central and South America, where I've been doing a lot of my work since I retired from the Park Service back in 2015, is that we're really seeing cultures down there that have an unbroken relationship with fire. So that it's a really powerful thing to see cultures that haven't had that kind of colonial strong arm at times take away fire. Because back in Florida in the old Spanish days, and you can find these entries in the old journals and some of the reports back to Seville and in the continent there, is that there was a belief by the um, the the Catholics that were here that fire use was somehow tied to the devil, and that got the natives in a lot of trouble as well. So with these kind of broken fire narratives, or as you know, I mean, you and your listeners that are using fire had to learn it from somebody. You know, as well as I
Sure.
do, all the NWCG PowerPoints in the world is not going to take you very far down the road. And just because you're a certified burner doesn't mean much else other than you're a certified burner. And maybe you can burn at night and you've cared enough to get that kind of thing. So anyway, some of this knowledge has to run fairly deep. And good part of my work is I've been working in southern Belize, of all places, with two different clans of Maya, the Quechua and the Mopan. And they live on pine, palmetto, wiregrass savannas that are adjacent to broadleaf tropical forests. And it's interesting that these pine savannas go all the way to the ocean. And the archaeological data and anthropology data and some of our work with pond coring down there is showing that they probably facilitated these savanna landscapes from the coast where they got food and salt to the big Maya temples in the mountains and over on the Guatemala side. And when I'm trained, and I do a lot of training down there, because as these countries start to change, and the similar thing happened here in North America, probably the similar thing came to Florida when I mentioned fence laws, the terraforming, as we called it, we might call it, is once you start putting roads, grids, communities in, and that's an overlay on top of natural landscapes. So what I see down south is people using, like was done here at one time in the past, using the natural landscape and not having fire breaks, not having to worry about a fire putting smoke on a community that's relatively new. And for example, as in Belize, there's a lot of Europeans, Americans, and Canadians moving down there with a low tolerance of fire, and they want to live on the coast in the beautiful Caribbean Sea. And now the Maya are starting to have to worry about some of the same things that we were concern ourselves when we're planning and implementing a prescribed burn. Where does the smoke go? What if it escapes? So their old indigenous knowledge is having to adapt. They know their fire effects really well. They know their fuels very well. But some of the other aspects that we use in fire management are now becoming very useful to the folks in that part of the world as well.
That's great. Yeah, it must be a steep learning curve for them to try to overcome the human element side of things. Now that they have all this ancestral knowledge, now they have to think about, working around more human dominated systems, which must be interesting.
Well, and it's actually more than just a human dominated, it's a different culture that's kind of now, just like in Florida, plopped down on top of the old culture. And
I see, yeah.
And adaptations have to be made. For example, if you ever looked at a Maya community, we have this concept, which I think is sometimes makes me roll my eyes, but it's a very real concept called wildland-urban interface. And unfortunately, for example, in Maui, in those fires recently, and almost all fires that affect urbanized areas, once they get into the neighborhood, then it's not burning tree to tree, it's burning residence to residence. But if you look at the Maya communities down there that live in flammable or ecotones and use fire, they're living in palmetto and palm thatch houses with palmetto bark and pine bark exteriors. Now, that's the fire triangle built to burn right there.
All in one place.
But you will notice, like in the old days around the South, the yards have no fuel in it. They're well swept. The idea of a fire getting even close to a home or a community and doing damage is extremely rare, even though they live in ecosystems that are far more flammable than some of the places here in North America.
So do you incorporate any of those experiences that you learned down in that part of the world into these classes that you're teaching today here in the United States?
Yeah, I do. And one of the things that really leaps out to me, and if you're taking fire classes and for example, a fire behavior, a fuel model class, or a prescribed fire burning, planning or implementation type of classes, we get obsessed with behave runs and fuel models and rates of spread. All of those are really important. I don't want to diminish those. But one of the things that I would that I try to encourage is to really know the place that you're burning well. And what do I mean by that? Know the fuels, how fire is going to react to it, what wildlife lives there, what are your real objectives? Why are you burning this? And if I hear another hazard fuel objective, I think I'm going to climb up in the bell tower and start screaming.
Hazard fuel reduction, that's an easy one to put on the list.
Yeah, but what does that mean?
Exactly, yeah.
Without picking on that too much, sure, okay, hazard fuel reduction. But there's so much more to that. In other words, one of the things I like and one of the things I appreciate about Florida is often we have burners, I call them burners, they're prescribed fire professionals or fire management professionals or conservation professionals across the state that actually live on the place where they burn. Or they
That's really the best way to get to know it. Yeah.
Absolutely, hands down. And that's one of the difference. Often I came out of back in the ancient days, I worked for Florida Forest Service in the late 70s. And then I went on to work for the National Park Service. And of course, I do training all over the United States and all over the Western Hemisphere right now. But one of the things that I see is often, because we become career motivated, we might stay on a site a few years, but we want that promotion. We're not getting paid much. We need to send our kids to school, all of those kind of things. And so we take a promotion. We might end up in a regional office or
I'll raise my hand and say, that's happened.
Yeah. And so think about the brain trust that moves off that land. And that those subtle little things like nesting doesn't always happen at the same time of year, especially if you're a ground nesting bird. If you've got neotropical migrants passing through, if you've got, do you really know on this patch that you're about to change for a very long time, do you know the outcomes of what will happen after you light that match? And one of the things that I see indigenous people doing in a more qualitative way, but we recently moved it into a quantitative type of methodology, is they understand, they keep their objectives simple. And also they do monitoring of some kind, immediately after burn, and well into the future. And that tells them when it's time to burn it next. And also in our vocabulary, it would be the equivalent of AAR, after action review. Did we meet our objectives?
Sure.
Were objectives even appropriate for this landscape? Was burning this time of year, did it really get the job done? And unfortunately, in a lot of environments, the big thing to have nowadays is to have the big acres. We just for example, to be able to post on Facebook that you burn 3,000 acres, the biggest burn in your unit's history. But when I see that, I want to say, how do you know? Yeah, you've got the quantitative part down, but the qualitative part, I just think that we can do better. So one of the things that I try to bring to any course or any conversation I have is elevating your level of awareness about what's really going on down there. And you probably know this, and this is that I asked you, how'd you learn to burn? It's almost like sometimes we have this long historic phone game going on. Well, if you burn it this time of year and you burn it with backing fire and you do a few split ignitions and you shut the door on the backside, we'll be able to get so many acres done this year. And it's what I call that I see in Florida. If we burn it, they will come mentality. If we just burn it the right season, then, dogs and cats, sparrows and bobwhites are going to be living together and everything's going to be good because we burned it, after May 15th during growing season, or we burned it with a good north wind when the RH was 35 to 45.
Yeah, I've often thought about that, how everybody learns about fire in a little bit of a different way, but it's really part of our DNA. And
yes,
for me, and I pondered this a lot. It's like, if fire has been ever, as Dr. Stephen Pine talks about, ever since there's been combustible material on this planet, there's been fire, basically. So it's really, he pointed that out, and I was like, that was kind of an aha moment for me. So if what he's saying is true, which it is, that means that it's just a natural part of what we do as anything, as any other natural thing, eating or sleeping, or obviously cooking, all that stuff is fire is very much intertwined with that. So I thought that was great that you highlighted those things, because there's there's these cultures that are still using fire in a very ancestral sense, but we, in our culture, we pick it up. We've sort of picked it up in bits and pieces from different areas, and a lot of people have different opinions about it, but we're still, and now we've got science driving and helping us make better decisions. So we're coming around full circle, but we're just in a little bit of a different way, rather than it being handed down from generation to generation, So it's been great hearing about some of your experiences. In your instance, it was handed down to you from generation to generation. You just don't hear that very often, and that's really fascinating.
I would put out there, though, that if you went to a prescribed fire meeting, one of the prescribed fire council meetings, and I think in Florida you may have 2 or 3, certainly North and Central Florida fire councils are highly functioning. I think when you walk in that room, you're going to be seeing a culture. And I think it's interesting that they call it a council. And
it's true.
If you roll up to a prescribed burn and you don't have a yellow shirt on and you have sneakers and you have jeans and an old metal hard hat, you're going to be kicked out of that culture pretty soon. Or people are going to be whispering around the backside of the engine, what is this dude doing here? And do you see what he's up to? It's that old saying that fight fire aggressively, but provide for fashion first. And that certainly is. And in Florida, there's probably...
We need a bumper sticker. That's another good one.
Yeah, I noticed.
Greg Seaman had some good bumper stickers. Bumper sticker quotes. I like that one too.
And Greg is a remarkable asset in Florida. But here's the thing that, I kind of chuckle about Florida bumper stickers when it comes to fire. I think I even mentioned one. Biodiversity means biodiversity or something like that. And one organization was just touting that they had so many years of good fire. And I would ask that organization, how do you know? Is just because you burned X thousands of acres or over a few decades, does that mean that your fire was good? And that gets back to my kind of soap ladder on my soapbox about monitoring the effects of your fire. Fires, you know this. I mean, and you think one of the things that I've seen, especially in Brazil and almost all the places I go where indigenous people are still powerful, Belize, Costa Rica, is that they understand very quickly. And think about this: when you're doing that kind of ritualistic test fire, which people do, but it's like we know the answer when it's done. It's very rare that we have a test fire. It's like a no-go, but it's a ritual that we indulge ourselves in. But in these kind of fire events that we have are highly ritualized, and then think about lighting a prairie or lighting a palmetto patch or a dog hair thicket. You're transforming that patch very rapidly. And if you did not understand physics and combustion and a lot of other things, you could see where that would be almost a powerful mystical experience to be able to take the forest or the prairie or the wetland from one condition and with one technology that you brought out of your pocket or you made with your fire stick, then you're able to transform a landscape and then bring some good things for a community village into it, whether it's browsing deer or you'll be able to forage better or your blueberry patch might respond, all of that. It's a very powerful thing. And I try to share with folks is that understand what a powerful thing that you're doing out there. We mostly worry about our fires escaping, what the boss will say, what our peers will say about our burn. But really, I would encourage people to think about what the land and its inhabitants say about your burn as well.
Very good. Very, very good food for thought. One final question I had for you, Rick, was, were there any memorable experiences you had abroad that you would like to share with the group before we sign off?
Okay, I was in Brazil a few years ago with teaching a course with the U.S. Forest Service International Program, and they almost always send a smoke jumper with me because in Forest Service think those are their biggest, baddest dudes, even or women as well. And so we were in a fairly remote place, and it was an indigenous group, and they don't normally wear the same kind of pants that we wear. In other words, they're mostly barefooted, but to follow the Forest Service rules, we were going to go out and do a field exercise. Well, we had to pass out Nomex. And it was just the oddest thing to say. For our next exercise, we're going to be dealing with live fire. So we need to have everyone put on pants and these boots. And you can imagine the looks we got. People who are not used to wearing pants, not used to wearing boots.
Right.
But, they were following the rules, I guess. And so it was one of these endearing moments where, in their lack of comfort, now these guys walk around burn areas with barefooted and with bare legs.
Oh, wow. So they're most days, they're on the line, they're doing their thing barefoot out there, huh?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, with just these, I won't, I don't know the name for the traditional dress, but it's essentially a loincloth. So they
had to suit up,
I will tell you that working internationally and working with these tribes gives you a lot of joy. It's easy to say that they had to suit up, in that typical put the yellow shirt on. But one of the things that was really cool when we came back is the women of the village had taken the yellow Nomex shirts that we had left them with, and they had made these beautiful embroidered designs on them, like jaguars and birds and those kind of things. So they really brought that old stinky Nomex on up to the next level.
Awesome. Wow, that sounds like a great cross-cultural experience, no doubt. Well, thank you for your time, Rick. Is there any one final message that you would like to leave for folks that are eager to learn more about fire?
What I would encourage folks to do is any time that you can be on a fire, no matter what your profession is get out there on the fire. And I encourage you to always watch, no matter how routine that burn unit is. You've burned it 3 or 4 times. I would encourage you to be a student of fire. And that means watch what's burning, what's not burning, how's the fire behaving, and how, and also, of course, I'm going to say, keep an eye on the effects of your fire, because each one of these fires is an experiment. Their outcomes are always different, no matter how many times we try to replicate the same prescription. And the other thing that I would encourage folks to do is take care of your people and your crew. Be kind, and don't worry about the boss so much.
Great advice. Well, we really appreciate you, Rick, and we certainly are thankful that you have taken us in another step beyond the fire.
I'm grateful for you and what you're doing and all the Florida prescribed burners. I'm proud of what's going on here in this state.
All right. Awesome. Thanks.